Hello, everybody. This is Pastor Jared Kress with another episode of Off Script with Pastor Jared. I've been told that I need to work on a jingle for this. You know how podcasts have a little ditty before the host gets into it, some little musical thing. I might, just throw down an electric guitar part or a little acoustic guitar riff and try them out over the next couple of ones. Who knows? Anyways, y'all been telling me I need to step up my game with a little jingle, so I might do that. Today's episode is, I'm basically going to call it, Are All Sins the Same? Are all sins the same? Now, the reason I bring this up is, obviously, we sit here in June 2021, and it is Pride Month, as the world says, which is intended to draw our attention to being openly proud of LGBTQ identity. And so, obviously, as a Christian perspective, there's really no way to make that work. So that's not really what I'm here today to talk about. I did address that a little in Sunday's sermon. I'm on record as clearly and openly stating that there's really no way that the Christian worldview can accommodate that. What I want to talk about today is really more so of one argument that tends to be used to support the idea of supporting the homosexual lifestyle, or at least walking back the more aggressive push against it. So it usually goes something like this. A Christian and a non-Christian are talking about the sin of homosexuality or some sexual sin, and they're trying to come to a common ground on what they can agree on. Maybe scriptures are tossed back and forth, or different arguments are made. But oftentimes what you'll then hear is a Christian say, well, in the end, all sins are the same, so your sin is no different than my sin. And so they might say to someone practicing homosexuality, your sin is no different than mine. Now, what I want to look at today is whether or not that is true, because we use that a lot. And most of the times when that argument is used, it's an attempt to soften homosexuality or soften some sexual perversion or some sin, and to kind of bring it down to the level of any other sin in a category, and really to remove categories of sin. That's kind of what the argument is. It's to make all blades of grass the same height. And what I would like to do today is to cause you to perhaps pause and think about whether we want to go down that road. Okay, I'll explain myself here. So first, I want to answer the question up front, because I hate when people take forever to answer the question. Are all sins the same? Well, I can answer that with a yes, and I can answer that with a no. All right. So the answer is, what do you mean by that? But there is a clear answer. So if what you mean by are all sins equal, or are all sins the same, in that is any sin committed able to send you to hell? That answer is yes. All right. And I got scripture support for that. James 2:10 says, for whoever keeps the whole law but fails at one point has become guilty of all of it. Okay. So in other words, if you have the law of God sitting before you, specifically if you're a Jewish person staring at the 613 commandments of the Old Testament, and you have that monster sitting in front of you, you could say, man, I kept most of these all the days of my life. But the literal reading of this is that if you've broken one law one time, no matter what it is, you are guilty of breaking all of it, because sin has affected and infected you. So if you sin one time, you're a sinner, because the standard of righteousness is Christ. So if our standard of whether if you're in the Old Testament, your standard was the perfect holiness of God. If you're in the New Testament, it's the perfect life lived by Christ. Either way, the standard is be holy, for I am holy. Okay? The problem is not a single person has ever been perfect, sinless, No one has ever kept all the law except Jesus. He's the only one that's ever done it. So when James 2:10 says, "For whoever keeps the whole law but fails at one point has become guilty of all of it," that's true. So on that level, we can say any sin committed makes you equally guilty of all the law and therefore deserving of hell. So if the only sin you ever commit in your life is a lie, or, you stole an apple from the cart down on the market, you're guilty. You have sinned against a holy God, because his standard of righteousness is that you not steal, that you not lie. So you're guilty. So in that sense, yes, any sin is the same. Any sin is able to send you to hell, condemns you, and makes you liable to judgment. Okay, yes. Now, there's another way that you have to answer this question if you're going to be biblically faithful. And that is that there are different ways that sin is measured and judged all throughout the Bible. Okay, so I want to give you a couple of examples just to start thinking that maybe not all sins, we should not even treat all sins the same. Okay, so for example, if we look at the Old Testament law, there's all sorts of different laws and punishments. If you do this, then this will happen to you, all right? So they're all over. If you don't believe me, crack open Leviticus and take a read, okay? All throughout that, there are different crimes and different punishments and different ways to be punished depending on what sin is committed. Okay, so there are capital punishments in the Old Testament. If you do this, you shall surely die. Like, those are all over. Murder, you can be killed. Blasphemy, adultery. There are sins in the Old Testament law that if you do them, then the punishment according to the law is that you must die. Okay, there are also crimes, sins, that are not punishable by death. There are some crimes where you just pay a fine, bring 3 oxen and, 5 rams to the guy that you wronged, and it's over, So there are different standards for different sins in the Old Testament law. It's the same in our culture today. If you go out and you kidnap somebody and you hold them hostage, in a prison cell in your basement for a year, that's a very different crime and punishment than if you, stole a pack of boxers from Walmart. I mean, these are very different things, and your crime would be very different. So the Old Testament doesn't pretend that sins are the same weight. Another way to think about that is there's a specific Old Testament word called abomination, and that word is not used of every sin. The word abomination is only employed for very specifically detestable sins to God. Okay, so I would do a word study in your free time if you're really up for this, and see, what occasions prompts that word abomination, or the great sin of the Old Testament in that prophecy is the abomination of desolation. I mean, that's a big word, but that just shows you there are times when it seems like the seriousness of the sin is higher. Okay, so let's not pretend that's not the case. Another example I'd like to give you is in Ezekiel 8, there's a prophetic vision that God gives Ezekiel. And it's actually really long to read, so I'm not going to do it here on the podcast, but I would encourage you read Ezekiel chapter 8 in context, and you'll see that God is giving Ezekiel this vision. And the point is to expose the sin of the nation at that time, and he's showing him a sequential picture of an increasing sin. So God would show Ezekiel, it's kind of like Tiny Tim, hey, let's pop in and look at this vision. And they look in and they see this sin, and it's pretty bad. And then God says at the end of that, but still there's greater abominations that I show you. And then they pop into the next scene, and he shows them this scene. And now the guys are, worshiping the pictures on the wall in the temple. And oh my goodness. And God says, well, there's still greater abominations that I will show you. And it's this culmination building to this final one final scene where all the elders of Israel are in the temple with their backs to the Holy of Holies, and they're facing the sun, and they're bowing down and they're worshiping it in the temple. And it's this, oh my goodness, moment. And this is the great abomination that he was building to, because they had basically turned against God and worshiped idols in the temple. And so the point was, everything I'm showing you, Ezekiel, God says, is worse sin. It's ramping up the depravity of this sin every time I show you. So that shows that in the mind of God, there are levels and greater depravity levels of sin. All right. A New Testament example I want to give you. John 19:11. Jesus is talking to Pilate there, and they're at that final moment where Jesus and Pilate are sort of facing off before he's crucified. And it says, John 19:11, Pilate said to him, "Will you not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" And Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above. Therefore," now listen to this, "he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." Has the greater sin. So, from the mouth of Jesus himself, what he was telling Pilate is that, we're kind of zooming out from this, but Pilate was essentially a pawn in this story. And yes, Pilate had autonomy and he chose to do what he did. He washed his hands clean and said, this isn't really, I find no fault in Jesus, but he still pulled the trigger. So Pilate's accountable. But Jesus' point was, the Jewish people, Caiaphas, Annas, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, were far more accountable to the knowledge that they had. Pilate wasn't walking around with Jesus all these years, watching him teach, seeing the miracles. Pilate was just the last guy that he got shuffled in front of, the Roman do-boy. Jesus had been talking to the Pharisees for 3 years and change, and these guys knew who he was. They were plugging their ears, and they knew very well what they were doing to Jesus. And so Jesus says, the ones who delivered me to you, Pilate, have the greater sin, because they were in full knowledge of what they were doing. They were crucifying the Son of God, whereas Pilate was just pulling the trigger at the very end there. He didn't fully understand. He hadn't walked with Jesus all these years like they had. So there is an element of more accountability to greater revelation that is available to you. And then one last little example that I thought would be helpful too is in something from Paul. And so in 1 Corinthians 5:1, Paul says to the Corinthian church, he's reporting on this hearing of a sexual sin in the church that he can't believe what he's hearing. He says, "It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you of a kind not tolerated even among pagans. For a man has his father's wife, and you are arrogant about it. Ought you not rather mourn? Let him who has done this be removed from among you." Okay, if we think about that, think of all the letters of Paul that he writes. He addresses a lot of sins in the churches that he writes to. Okay, Paul is not unaware. He's not naive. He's not sheltered. Okay, so Paul knows what's out there, and he has corrected a lot of sins in a lot of letters. But this incident in the Corinthian church of a man sleeping with, I don't know by the text if it's his mother or if it's a remarriage of his father, but either way, a man and his father are sleeping with the same woman, and it may be his mother. My goodness. I mean, Paul hears this, and his mind is blown, and he says, look, you guys, this doesn't even happen in the pagan world. I mean, you can go and you can't find this stuff out among the heathens, all right? And so his statement is, remove this person from the church, because they're bragging about it. They're out to do a sin, a brazen sin like this, and then to go and brag about it and be arrogant about it. Paul says the best way to handle it is actually to remove this person from the fellowship. So the fact that that's the diagnosis from Paul on this sin, and he doesn't do that for other sins, shows you in the mind of Paul, there is a disgust level that can be reached. Okay? So take all of that, swirl it around your mind as you're thinking and you're putting this answer together. Are all sins equal? Well, my answer would be, I know that you don't really believe the answer is yes. I know you don't. If someone did something horrible, murdered your family, okay, and then that same person also stole a loaf of bread, there is no way with a straight face you would say that we're all sinners and it's all equal and these are the same. No. So the reason why I say that is because oftentimes in our discussion of sexual sins, homosexuality or something else, where we're trying to win someone over, we're trying to bring them in, often we'll use this argument that I don't know how helpful it really is, where we'll say, well, sure, what you're doing is a sin, but your sin is just the same as any other sin. Just know, in the mind of God, that's not actually true. There are sins that anger God more than other sins, okay? In that Ezekiel story, bowing down and worshiping an idol in the temple of God really got God angry. And there were things all throughout the years in the Old Testament you can see certain things just lit a fire under him and got him more angry than other things. Okay? And that's because God is not simple. Okay? He's not simple-minded where he can understand the gravity of different sins. Okay? And that's why we do. We have a gut reaction to sins that are really bad because we're supposed to. And so I think when we go into these arguments and say, sure what this is a sin, but, and then we start just walking it back and dialing it back and trying to make it nothing, I don't think that helps, because when something really bad happens later, say a child is abused or something, we lose then our ability to call that evil because we've then dialed back that all sins are really the same. So yeah, sure, child abuse is bad, but so is stealing boxers from Walmart. It's like, come on, get a grip. There's no way that's real, okay? There are different sins and different weights to sin. And in life, there's different consequences to sin. And that's not just in life. That's in the mind of God. So I would just encourage you, as you think through this, don't make arguments that are going to hurt you later, such as all sins are really the same. Only in one way is that true. It's true in the fact that any sin you commit holds you liable of breaking all the law. Any sin you commit makes you defiled. And that's why the Bible says that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, because all it takes is one. The wages of sin are death. We're all going to die because we are all sinners. And it doesn't matter what sin we commit. We are all sinners because we sin and because there's a sin nature that prompts us to sin. And we do. We've committed actual sins. And that's true. And that's why Christ is the Savior of anyone who calls. Everyone needs Christ equally badly. Okay. We need Christ. But the sins that we commit do have different weights and do have different consequences and do anger God differently. And I think that it's not helpful when we pretend that that's not true. Okay, so hopefully this has been beneficial to you guys. That's why I do these, to equip the saints for the work of ministry. So I would encourage you, tell a friend about the podcast. That's how we get more listeners, and that's how more people get equipped. God bless. Have a wonderful day. I'll see you next time on Off Script.